Okay, good morning again. So that's your introduction to the Institute of Criminal Justice Studies for about 15 minutes. I've now got just slightly less than an hour to introduce you to criminology. So that, I think, is a much harder task, to be honest. I've been a criminologist for over 20 years. So if someone was to ask me what is criminology, I should find that quite easy. If you asked a plumber, what's your job about? If you asked a taxi driver, what's your job about? You would expect people to be able to describe the job and the role that they're involved with. I'm laying out my excuses now because actually criminology is really quite difficult to discuss. And when I decided a few years ago that it would be really useful for students to have an overview of what criminology was all about, it was then that I started to struggle to define what it is. Because criminology is a social science, it's full of discussion, it's full of debate, it's full of argument about what its core is, and whether it should be useful, whether it should be something practical, whether we as criminologists should be solving the crime problem, whether we should be doing broad things like, whether we should be discussing theoretical criminology in our ivory towers. So there's some real debate about what criminology is and then what criminology is for. And we've also got to think about what criminology encompasses as well. And I know some of you sitting here about to embark on a fraud degree or a security degree or a policing and investigation degree and think, what's criminology got to do with me? Criminology is such a wide and broad discipline, and it draws on such enormous backgrounds and from so many different disciplines that it's really important to understand, I suppose, the core of what criminology is in order that we can understand all of the offshoots that come away from criminology as well. So that I thought I would say first of all as the reason why this may be more difficult to explain than you might think. And even before I think we can decide what criminology is, we also have to think as well about what crime is. Now, for some people, crime will be what you naturally expect it to be, and you will think of offences like assault, you'll think of the police, you'll think of forensics. But some people, not suggesting you because many of you work in the area, will not think more broadly about what crime may be. If you think about the oil and gas and chemical leak in Bhopal in India in 1984, where almost 4,000 people were killed at the time, and about 8,000 people have died since as a result of complications because of that. People wouldn't necessarily associate that with a crime. It may not be the first thing that they think of. Or if you think about what happened in 2010 with the Deepwater Horizon oil rig spill, where 205 million gallons of crude oil spilt into the Atlantic. Issues like that, issues like food fraud, environmental crime or green crime, tax evasion, which is often called evasion rather than fraud. All of those areas are as central to crime, and perhaps even more central to crime at the moment than some of our traditional conceptions of crime around assault and the interventions of the police. So then we need to think about what criminology is. It's been described by a very famous criminologist, David Downs, as being a rendezvous subject, almost like a cuckoo that just steals bits and pieces from other disciplines. And the other disciplines that produce criminologists are things like sociology and psychology, and more recently, I suppose, things like politics, economics, geography, forensics. You've got all of those aspects as well. Even things like accounting and IT, where criminology now features. But even though it is this relatively new area, although we'll be going back to the 18th century shortly, what we do know is that criminology as a discipline is booming, and we only have to see the enormous amounts of criminology students around not only this campus but around many other campuses around the UK to know that it is still a source of great fascination to many people. So what I've decided that criminology is, and this might be very, very different from another criminologist who might argue that it's completely different, is I would suggest that criminology centres around three main questions. The first question is, how much crime is there? And that's actually a far more difficult question than you might imagine. We have to think about where it's committed, who's at most risk of committing it, how has crime changed over time, and that's something that we will be looking at during this lecture. We then need to think about the second question of what causes crime. What causes crime, and what are the factors that lead to criminality or might lead to criminality? And then lastly, if we want to be a useful discipline, then we need to think about how crime can be controlled, and what is the evidence in terms of the best ways to control crime. What can be done to try to reduce crime? So I would argue that those are the three central questions. All of these slides will be available on Moodle afterwards, so if you don't want to scribble things down, you just want to sit and listen, that's absolutely fine. I also know that I've got practitioners in the room who will know about some of the areas that I'm talking about, so additionally, if you do want a small dose at any point, I will not take it badly. I will assume that you know what I'm talking about already. So starting off with the first question then, how much crime is there? Now, when the Office for National Statistics released their annual crime stats in July this year, the headline findings were very interesting. If we exclude computer misuse and fraud statistics, the Crime Survey for England and Wales estimated that there were approximately 6 million offences for the year ending March 2018. 6 million offences. This figure was broadly similar to the year ending March 2017, and March 2017 was the lowest number of crimes since the Crime Survey for England and Wales began in 1981. So it was the lowest figure since 1981. When they were released in 2017, when they were released in 2018, broadly similar. So you might imagine this was good news. What you maybe wouldn't imagine is the headlines that came out the next day. This is from the Daily Mail, the Daily Star and the Sun, who talk about crime soaring. They talk about Britain's crime epidemic. Despite the fact that if you look at what the Crime Survey for England and Wales say, it is that for the year ending March 2018, most types of crime have stayed at levels similar to the previous year. And remember that the previous year was the lowest on record, since records began in 1981. So what's going on? If we take violent crime as an example, then we can see why this is actually quite a complex picture. Now, the Crime Survey for England and Wales is a victim survey, and therefore it doesn't show homicide. So we need to look at the other type of statistic on crime, and that's police recorded crime. And that has shown a rise in homicides over the last few years. It's shown a rise from 2016, when there were 574, to 2017 when it was 723, so quite a big rise then, and then a much smaller rise of only 13 to March 2018. So we have seen a rise in the rate of homicide. But if you just look at those bare figures, then you can imagine that there would be concern in the media and reports of concern in the media. But what the media don't mention is that that big rise that I just referred to there includes the 96 victims of the Hillsborough disaster, because that was the year in which their deaths were recorded. So that meant that the percentage rose quite considerably during that time. The data that's just been released in July of this year also includes the victims of the Manchester Arena bombings and the London attacks as well. Because homicide, as many of you will know, includes the offences of murder, manslaughter, corporate manslaughter and infanticide. So when you delve down a little deeper into the figures, you can start to see why there might have been rises in particular offences. Let's take homicide out of the equation now, because that's quite complex and you can only look at police recorded statistics. Let's look at violence more generally. The Office for National Statistics has said that the Crime Survey for England and Wales is a much better record and a much better measure of trends than other forms of statistics. Because other forms of statistics, it is argued, are not very good at looking at trends. And I think when we're looking at criminal statistics, that's what we need to be looking at, is trends in crime. We're never going to possibly know the exact number of crimes, and therefore trying to count them is probably a fool's paradise. But if we can look at trends, that's where we can establish where the problems are and where the problems may be in the future. And if we look at the trends here on violent crime, we can actually start to see the reality of the problem that we've got at the moment. If we look, in 2017, around 2 in 100 adults were victims of violent crime. 10 years before, it was 3 in 100 adults. And in 1995, when we were at the peak of offending in this country, it was 5 in 100 adults were victims of violent crime in 1995. So all of the furore that we see at the moment about the surge, the epidemic that you'll see, particularly in the tabloid newspapers, actually when you delve down into the figures, you can see that there is a considerable drop from the peak of violent crime, which was in 1995. Violent crimes are currently around 67% lower than they were during the mid-1990s. So the assessment from the Office for National Statistics is that actually lower harm, violent crime, is very stable. And that evidence is also borne out by another form of statistic that's actually very useful to look at, that's often not considered, and that's hospital admissions. If If we look at hospital admission data for people going into hospital with injuries, that only rose very, very tiny amount during the last year. But that's not the picture that we see in the media. And it's not just the media. They're not alone in their scepticism. If we look at the data on the public and what the public think about levels of crime, we can see that the majority of the public think that crime is rising across the country. If you ask them about what's going on locally, then they're slightly more positive. But still, you've got a sizable minority there thinking that crime is rising both locally and a majority thinking that it's rising nationally. And you can see an update on these statistics up to 2016. We can see that rates have been falling, but are still quite considerable. We're still on about 60% of people in the country who think that crime is going up. And this is the issue, because this links very closely with fear of crime. And fear of crime is something that's only been started to have been measured relatively recently. And fear of crime is an important indicator of the mood of the nation, really, in terms of what our feelings are about crime. Because what the Labour government realised when they were in power, that actually it didn't really matter if crime was going down, because crime was going down enormously when they were in power. I'm not saying it's because of their policies, maybe other reasons, we'll come on to that later. But crime was dropping hugely when they were in office. But what was rising during their time in office was people's fear of crime, and that's a problem in itself. What we know about fear of crime is that those who have previously been victimised are more likely to be fearful of crime. I think that probably makes sense. We also know that women are more fearful than men, despite the fact that they suffer much lower risks of victimisation than men do. And we also know that the elderly report more fear than younger people, despite, again, the fact that they are much less likely to be victims of crime. What those facts reveal to us is what is known as the fear-risk paradox, that the people who are most at risk of becoming victims of crime are the least fearful, and the people that are least at risk of becoming victims of crime are the most fearful. So that is something that needs to be addressed in addition to addressing the actual issue of crime itself, is trying to address the fear of crime. Because actually, young men are more likely to need education about the risks of crime than young women or older women, who are much less likely to be victims of crime. What we know about fear and risk is that they operate completely independently of each other. They're not related concepts at all. What's interesting, though, is that having taught the politics of criminal justice for many years, I've noticed over the last 5 to 8 years that crime has been dropping down people's agenda in terms of what they're most worried about in the country. But we're starting now to see that rising again. The latest Ipsos Mori poll now has crime, as public concern about crime, being the 4th biggest concern that we have in the country at the moment. Anybody want to hazard a guess on one of the top 3 concerns of the public at the moment about the country? Yeah. No. Brexit, yes. Brexit's number 1. Anyone going for number 2 or 3? Pensions. Sorry, I didn't.
Pensions.
Pensions, no.
Houses.
Houses, no.
Schooling?
No.
Funding cuts?
No.
Market?
No. Any more guesses? These are good guesses. They'll be in the top 10, I'm sure. Healthcare, good. And one more. Kind of what prompted the Brexit result.
Immigration. Right?
Immigration, yes, okay. So the top 3, Brexit, healthcare, immigration, and number 4 is now crime. Crime had slipped down to about 6 or 7 a few years ago, but is now creeping back up the agenda, prompted, no doubt, by the types of media headlines that we were just looking at there. So the reason that perhaps fear of crime is high is because of what we've just been seeing, is because there's a high level of fear of crime from those who are not at risk, but actually because of the headlines that people are saying. Also because there's a general distrust about what the statistics are telling us. Is it fair that we don't trust the statistics that we've got? There are 2 major data sources that we can rely on, really. And as I've already said, it's really difficult to try and establish the true rate of crime. It's difficult for many, many reasons. The first data source that we've got is generally considered to be the most authoritative, and that's the Crime Survey for England and Wales. It was originally known as the British Crime Survey, and it started in 1981. It used to be, it's a large household survey, and it asks people about their experiences of crime and criminal justice over the preceding 12 months. It used to be conducted about every 2 or 3 years. It's now an annual rolling survey, and it's seen to be our best indicator of trends of crime, which is important. And it was the statistics that I just talked about from the Crime Survey for England and Wales when I said that there were 6 million offences in the year ending March 2018. The second source of crime data that we've got is generally referred to as police recorded crime. Now, until 1981, when the British Crime Survey started, this was all we had in terms of knowing about how much crime there was. It's essentially administrative data that the police collect, and it reflects, firstly, what comes to the attention of the police, and we know that that's not all crime, and then it reflects what the police decide to record, and we know that the police don't record all crime. Now, in the year ending March 2018, I mentioned that there was 6 million, according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales. According to the police recorded stats, there were a total of 5.5 million offences, and that was a rise of 11% on the previous year. And those are the kind of headline statistics that the tabloids will be very interested in. They will quote the 11% rise with alacrity. The 11% rise, according to the ONS, is acknowledged to be related to improvements in recording practices, certainly pressure from Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary for police to record crimes better. We've definitely got an increase in the number of victims reporting crime, particularly domestic and sexual abuse. But also there's some genuine increases in some crime types as well. And it seemed to be an indication of all of these factors that have related to the rise that we have seen, particularly in violent and sexual offending, that comes particularly from more victims coming forward. And additionally, you have the creation of new offences as well. So, for example, coercive and controlling behaviour, which is now a criminal offence, which will result in more victims coming forward. If we're interested in trends, and that's probably as far as we can go with statistics, both the Crime Survey for England and Wales and police recorded crime indicated that crime rose during the 1980s and has been declining for at least the past decade or so, although now becoming more stable and perhaps a slight increase in some categories. You can see the yellow figure there is if we add on crime, computer misuse and fraud to the offences. That's something that's only been an experimental issue over the last few years, but we're seeing that data now being added to the main data. So how trustworthy are our two main sources? How trustworthy is the Crime Survey for England and Wales? How trustworthy is the police recorded stats? Well, recent revelations have cast very serious doubt on police recorded data. The House of Commons Public Administration Select Committee has been scrutinising crime statistics. It heard from a series of witnesses, and it revealed long concerns about the methods in which police recorded crime was collected. So serious were the concerns that the UK Statistics Authority in 2014 took the decision to withdraw the status of national statistics from police recorded data, effectively meaning that for the time being that data should not be trusted at all, is what we're arguing. And police recorded statistics have not had their designation as national statistics reinstated. So as it stands now in 2018, they are not counted as national statistics. There has been a very recent report from Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. Actually, I should give it its proper name, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, Fire and Rescue Services. It's now very long. The recent report from them, the State of Policing, has recognised that police forces are making big improvements in the area, but they're still now not designated as national statistics. So this leaves us then with the Crime Survey for England and Wales. The report, as I said, in 2017 showed a reduction in all major offences, and in 2018 shows relative stability. Might it be missing something? How far can we trust the Crime Survey of England and Wales? The answer to might it be missing something is undoubtedly yes. First of all, the Crime Survey for England and Wales only covers people living in private households, so people living in institutions, university accommodation, prisons, care homes, the homeless, will not be counted. It's also a personal survey, therefore businesses will not be asked about their experiences of victimisation. So shoplifting, for example, won't be counted. Until very recently, it didn't consider anyone under the age of 16. So you've got, although we're now getting that data, we can't see the long-term trends in victimisation of younger people. Until last year, amazingly, the self-completion part of the questionnaire, which asked about intimate violence, sexual offences and domestic abuse, was only given to those aged between 16 and 59, as if at 59 suddenly your risk of being a victim of this kind of offence disappeared. That has now been increased to 74, although you are still missing out on some sections of the population. The next point is obviously it's a victim survey, and therefore it only asks victims, and therefore where you've got crimes where there is no victim who can be interviewed, for example in homicide or drug possession offences, then you're not going to get the data there. Also, the difficulty that you've got, just going back to the point about intimate violence, is that as it's a household survey, and as you've got people going around to people's houses to ask them questions, it can also be very difficult if you are the victim of domestic abuse and your perpetrator is there in the house with you. It's unlikely that you will be filling in the questionnaire in as honest way as you could. And finally, as I've mentioned, it's only until very recently that we've started to collect data on cyber-enabled crime. We've got 3 years of that data now, so we're beginning to see a better picture. The first year, it was only 6 months of data, and the number was doubled. I'm not sure if that's statistically accurate or not, but that's what the ONS decided to do. And then we've got a full year's data for the last 2 years. So there were 6 million offences, around 6 million offences in 2015-16, about the same in 16-17, and that went down this year to about 4.5 million offences. Given all of these issues, given all of the things that can potentially be wrong with the crime survey for England and Wales, is it possible that we have been overestimating this drop in crime that I was just referring to, that we've seen since the mid-1990s? Does this mean that crime perhaps hasn't dropped? Does it just mean that crime has mutated? It's difficult to say without any precision, to be honest. But even if we added the headline figures of the crime survey for England and Wales, which as I said was 6 million, even if we add that to the 4.5 million computer and fraud offences, we still only get to 10.5 million. And that's still almost half the peak number of offences in 1995, which was almost 20 million offences recorded by the crime survey for England and Wales. So there is no doubt that there are big problems with the crime survey for England and Wales, as you can see. There's no doubt that they are missing crimes, but I'm not sure that they're missing enough crimes to argue that there hasn't been a fairly substantial drop in crime since the mid-1990s. So it's only taken us that long to establish how much crime there is. You can see why these questions as criminologists is actually quite taxing. If we establish, therefore, I think we might be agreed that crime has dropped. Our next question as criminologists needs to be, well, why? Why has it dropped? As you might imagine, there is no consistent view on why crime may have dropped. There are lots of different alternative explanations. And I just want to run through a few of those with you. The first one is economic reasons. The argument about the link between crime and the economy argues that crime goes up during periods of economic difficulty and economic hardship. As there is less money around, as there is more unemployment, then crime, particularly acquisitive crime, tends to go up. The reverse argument is when the economy is doing well, when there is high levels of employment, when people have got spare money around, that acquisitive crime goes down, but what you see is that violent crime and sexual offences go up as people are spending more time out of the house and are spending more time drinking alcohol. So that is what we've seen in terms of trends of crime. This was a very influential report that was published first in 1990 by a sociologist in the Home Office, and it was towards the last days of Margaret Thatcher, and she completely rubbished the results as they came out, because if there is a link between unemployment and crime, then that means that governments now start needing to take responsibility, perhaps, or need to start doing more to address the issue of employment and unemployment. While the Conservatives like to argue that crime is an individual choice that people make, then they can take a step back and not take any responsibility for it. So she rubbished the report quite predictably. But you can see from just the directions of the arrows there that police recorded burglary tended to go up in the same patterns as unemployment rates going up as well. Where you see it diverging is where you got to the last economic crash. The lines start to go in a different direction, but that may be accounted for by the rise in cyber-enabled crime, so crime shifting into a different type of pattern. So that data has been quite strong, and we can see it repeated in more recent data that we can see coming out of the Home Office, that there is this link between the economy and crime. The second one that I want to look at is offender-based theories. There are all sorts of theories on this about rates of lead in water and all sorts of things, but probably the most obvious one in the offender-based theory idea is that changes in crime levels have been caused by demographic changes. So when you've got different numbers of people in the population at different ages, at different time periods, you'll get different crime rates. So we know that the peak age for offending is for males between the age of 16 to 24. So when you've got a large surge of that type of age group within your population, then you will tend to see a rise in crime during that time. And we have actually got an increased number of young men in that category at the moment that we saw from the increased birth rate around the time of the millennium. So it may be that that has an impact. It's worth noting, but because this obviously operates on a generational basis, any rise or fall in crime is likely to be quite gradual. We're also seeing at the moment a rise in a number of individuals who are most vulnerable, and that also, it could be argued, is leading to an increase that we've seen in particular types of violent crime at the moment. Data shows at the moment that we've got increases in the numbers of children in care, in children excluded from school, and also in homeless adults, and this has all risen in the last 4 years. The evidence suggests that being in care and being excluded from school in particular are markers for an increased risk of being a perpetrator of crime, but also an increased risk of being a victim of crime as well. Now, this doesn't mean that there's a link or causal link between the increases in the most vulnerable and serious violence. What it means is that those groups of people possess some of the factors that put them at higher risk of becoming either an offender or a victim, particularly of drug-related violence. So that might account, that demographic change might account for the rise that we've seen in that regard. A third idea is that the criminal justice system could play a part. As criminologists, we're often arguing that the criminal justice system actually has a very limited impact on crime. But there are some that argue that there is a link between the numbers of police officers that you have, for example, and levels of crime. The Police Federation will be the first to say that there's an incredibly important link there. Politicians will often deny it, but the current Home Secretary is actually now starting to talk about there being a link between police numbers and crime. There's also been studies that have looked at the rate of incarceration and crime. The data on this is not particularly conclusive, and it suggests that we need a huge rise in the prison population to even affect the crime rate a really tiny bit. But there is some limited evidence to suggest that that may happen, but only on a very limited basis. Next up is the idea of opportunity. The theories around opportunity would suggest that crime flourishes in conditions where it's easy to commit. And if it's difficult to commit, then crime rates will go down in those areas. And the opportunity theorists would argue that that's why you've seen the long-term trends in particular directions. They would argue, for example, that the long-term rise in burglary that we saw between the 1960s and the 1990s could be accounted for by the fact that during that time you'd got an increasing number of women leaving households and going out to work, therefore leaving empty houses. They would argue that the rise in shoplifting during this time could be put down to the fact that shop items were no longer behind the shopkeeper but were put out on display and therefore much easier to steal. They would argue that the rise in vehicle theft could be accounted for by the fact that we've got an increased number of cars on the road. In fact, there's evidence more recently that the rise in robbery could be accounted for by the possession of mobile phones, which in previous years people haven't had, and therefore an availability to steal. And the opportunity theorists would also argue, therefore, that the big drops in crime came about when increased security around some of these areas was improved. The trouble with these theories is that we saw the rise in crime at all the same time and across all offences, and then we saw the drop in crime at the same time and around all the same offences. And it's difficult to argue that the opportunity to commit burglary and then the restrictions on being able to commit burglary and car theft and shoplifting all happened at exactly the same time. But opportunity theory is one that is discussed quite regularly by criminologists. So that leaves us with one other, and obviously there are many others as well, these are just a selection. That leaves us with one other potential reason why crime may have fallen, and that's substance abuse. I've already mentioned alcohol. And alcohol tends to be a driver of violence rather than other crimes. So the link between alcohol and acquisitive crime isn't really there. It's much more likely that an increase in the alcohol intake is likely to lead to an increase in violent and sexual offences. So the big drop that we've seen is in acquisitive crime. So alcohol's not going to answer the question there. So is it a change in drug consumption? If we look at the data on this, the number of heroin users increased markedly through the 1980s and the early 1990s. And it's clear that by the 1990s, heroin use had increased to perhaps 10 or 20 times greater than it was in the 1970s. And the epidemic spread from area to area in the UK, but generally the peak occurred between 1993 and 2000. And crime peaked between 1993 and 1995. So there is a link there. And research tends to agree that heroin and crack users commit an incredibly large amount of offences, large enough to actually be an overall driver of crime trends. And Home Office research that was published in 2014, very extensive research, concluded that crimes committed by heroin and crack cocaine users could account for 50% of the crime rate rise from the early 1980s until 2005, and at the same time could also account for the drop in crime as these drug users either quit drugs or died. So that's incredible that you've got one section of the population that can have such an impact on overall crime trends, but the research data does seem to be quite conclusive on this. The current picture of drug use actually shows a very large increase in deaths from drug overdoses, which rose 50% between 2010 and 2015. So we're seeing a big increase in that area, but we're still seeing a much lower proportion of drug use amongst British citizens, and a particularly big drop amongst young people as well. So young people are they're not drinking as much, and they're certainly not taking as many drugs, they're not being locked up as much as they were, and they're not committing as many offences as they were. So it's the young people we've got to thank, it's the rest of us, I'm afraid, that are still being troublesome. So you can see that drug use has declined, but drug deaths are going up. Hopefully that is a bit of a picture for you about levels of crime at the moment and trends in crime. And as I said, trends is the important issue that we need to look at. The second big question then, as criminologists, is what causes crime? Explanations range from biological explanations, psychological explanations, sociology, cultural studies, even economics, as we've just looked at. And I suppose one of the big debates is around whether offenders are driven into crime because of circumstances that are outside of their control, either social deprivation or biological arguments or psychological arguments, whether it's something that they can't control themselves, or whether offenders choose to commit crime based on calculating the benefits of crime against the costs of crime. Now that last idea, that crime and criminal offending is a matter of choice, was one of the big founding principles of what's known as the classical school of criminology. And I said criminology was a relatively recent discipline. You can see actually it's not that recent at all. So the classical school of criminology was largely associated with the work of the Italian scholar Cesare Beccaria. He was writing about 250 years ago. And he believed that people commit crime because of a rational calculation. So, for example, you've made a rational, you may not think it's rational right now, you've made a rational calculation to start this degree course. You might make a rational calculation to go to the cinema at the weekend. You might make a rational calculation to take a sickie next week from work. And it's all about working out what the costs are and what the benefits are. And if the costs outweigh the benefits, you probably won't do it. If the benefits outweigh the costs, you may well do it. So Beccaria's argument is that we would all commit crime if we could, because we are all pleasure-seeking and we are all pain-avoiding. But we don't all commit crime because we enter into a social contract that actually we can't just all behave exactly as we wish, because the world would be chaos. So when you're in the work canteen and you finish your lunch and you've left, your portion of peas, you don't hurl it up in the air and run out the door. You stack it nicely and walk out, because we understand that there are certain, or maybe you do, I don't know. I knew the criminology students were troublesome. There are ways that we know that we have to behave. in order for society to function relatively smoothly. But Beccaria would argue that we enter into that social contract, and then there are some people who break that contract and they don't enter into the rules of the game. The problem really with a lot of classicism is that it didn't take into account anything to do with age, gender, people's mental ill health, previous convictions. So it was quite a sort of, one-size-fits-all strategy, really. Beccaria began to modify the ideas a little later on in his career. Another theory, and obviously this is a complete whistle-stop tour of criminological theory, came from another Italian scholar, another Cesare, this time Cesare Lombroso, who was a biological positivist. Lombroso believed that criminals had certain physical abnormalities or physical differences about them that led to them being more likely to commit crime. He argued that people who were going to commit crime had unusually shaped jaws, odd-shaped ears and noses, I'm not going to look at anyone while I'm saying this, excessively long arms, and an abundance of wrinkles. If you had 5 or more of these characteristics, according to Lombroso, you were what he called a born criminal. And here is a picture looking remarkably like Wayne Rooney of Cesare Lombroso's Born Criminal. And his work actually related to an old medieval law, which is incredible to think. The old medieval law said that if 2 people fell under suspicion of crime and they weren't sure who had committed the crime, the uglier or more deformed was to be regarded as probably more likely to be guilty. And that was in English law at the time. You can imagine that a lot of this biological positivism is not really well used today, but this is part of the journey towards criminology. Over time, what we've seen is that sociology has actually begun to have a much greater role in discussions about criminality. For example, the Chicago School of Crime, which started in about the 1930s in the United States, which argued that crime is much less about individuals. We shouldn't be looking about individual people. We should be looking at the environments in which people are living. And what the Chicago School of Crime argued was that if you were living in this transition zone, so you've got the central business district here, you've got the factories here, and then you've got the transition zone. If you're living in the transition zone, you are more likely to offend because of the circumstances that you're surrounded by. You're surrounded by high-rise housing, very poor housing, very unstable employment, a very transitory population that are moving in and out, very little support from criminal justice agencies, and therefore you are more likely to commit crime when you're in this environment. As people progress and perhaps get better, more secure employment and have more money, manage to move themselves out into the working class homes and the rich suburbs, then they're less likely to commit crime. So it's less about the individual and more about the environment in which they live. You've got other sociological theories like the strain theories of crime that argue that strain is a very normal part of society, and it's a result of the gap between the goals that people have and their means of achieving them. And the argument would be that all of us have got the same goals, but we've all got different means of getting to those goals. Some people are starting the race here, some people are starting the race back here, some people are over there with very great difficulty of getting there. And if they've got great difficulty in getting there in a legitimate way, they will go different ways to get to those goals, because we've all apparently got the same goals. So these are more sociological theories of crime, which look at more than just the individual. Now, there was a Canadian Prime Minister called Stephen Harper, who said in 2013, in response to this threat of crime that they had, that this is not the time to commit sociology. I wasn't sure it was a criminal offence. But this is actually the phrase that he used. It was in response to an inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada. And he said that it is not a sociological phenomenon, that crime is a series of individual events. And Harper's words echo very much those of Margaret Thatcher, as I've already referred to, and she said, famously, there is no such thing as society. The argument is that crime isn't a social phenomenon, it's a series of individual incidents. And the advantage, as I've said, for politicians in doing that is if it's all down to individual events, then individuals are solely responsible for crime. And therefore you can start to largely ignore the structural inequalities that we have, the structural injustices that we have in society, because it's all down to individual choice. So if we paint social problems as individual problems, we can lose that sense of social responsibility that goes with our society. Now, I really don't want to get into critical criminology because this throws the whole thing up, but I will just very briefly mention critical criminologists who argue that there is no such thing as crime anyway. Because what they would argue is that crime is defined in legal terms. And if we look to the law is not neutral. The law is made for the benefits of certain populations over other populations. And therefore, the law is not neutral. We should not look at the law as the starting point. What critical criminologists would say is that only acts exist, and it's then up to societies and governments and politicians and the powerful to decide which are criminal and which are not. So you only have to look at the incident of murder, for example, which in a wartime situation would not be a crime, but in other situations it can be. You look at different countries where offences are different in different parts of the world. So they would argue that the category crime has no reality, and so we shouldn't really be looking at what's crime or criminal, we should be looking at harm. And that's something that criminologists are talking much more about at the moment, is looking at harm rather than crime. Because actually, if we look at things that are causing the most harm, they're not necessarily the things that we're concentrating on. So if you look at tax evasion, for example, if you think about the cost to our country of rich corporations not paying tax, you could argue that the harm that they are causing the country is far greater than moped theft, for example. And it's about how as a society we define crime and harm. And then the final question that we need to consider as criminologists is how we control crime. There are enormous numbers of facts and figures on all of this, but what we do know is that the money spent on crime has dropped in recent years due to austerity and budget cuts. But there is still an enormous amount spent by both the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice on trying to control crime. We also know that the number of police officers has dropped very dramatically since 2010, and the number of prison officers has also dropped quite dramatically. And we're also seeing an increase in private sector involvement in our criminal justice system. This just shows us an example of what's going on around the world in terms of where private security now outnumbers the public police. And we can see that that is the case in the United Kingdom, as in many other countries as well. What we know is that private security growth has been seen very significantly within the probation sector, although all of that is up in the air now with the end of the transforming rehabilitation agenda. We've seen private companies being responsible for our probation services. And we've also seen the growth since the mid-1990s of private prisons. We have 14 private prisons in the UK. So criminology therefore also needs to consider the agencies within the criminal justice system in the control of crime: police, courts, probation, prisons, the third sector and the private sector. Now, just very briefly looking at a couple of those in terms of policing and prisons, although we'll be looking at these in more detail tomorrow. There's been much political debate at the moment about police numbers. Central government cuts to police funding has, as we've just seen, resulted in a big loss of police officer numbers, just under 25% since 2010. But it's notable, as I mentioned earlier on, that the new Home Secretary is actually linking police numbers with rises in crime. And some have begun to question whether the reduction in stop and search might be related to an increase in violent crime, a very small increase. Ministers and obviously the current Prime Minister, who was Home Secretary for many years, have disputed that there is a clear relationship, pointing to the fact that actually stop and searches began to drop before we saw the rise in crime. Yet in many ways this is the wrong question. The point is not whether the fall in the use of stop and search has caused the increase in violence, that's probably highly unlikely, but whether the fall in the number of stop and searches is undermining the police's ability to get a grip on the situation, and that's much more likely. By definition, less use of stop and search reduces the certainty of punishment, and that all links to the area of deterrence. The fewer stops and searches that take place, the less likely offenders are to be deterred from carrying offensive weapons, and the less likely they are to be arrested. Now, clearly there are broader issues around stop and search, such as disproportionality, concerns about public confidence as well, but it's a debate that probably needs to be had in terms of the armoury that the police have in order to try to tackle crime. And as Paul said in his speech earlier, there is also a huge problem in our prison system at the moment. One area particularly of concern is the suicide and murder rate in prisons in England and Wales, which have reached their highest levels in years, according to Ministry of Justice figures. In 2017, there were 3 alleged homicides and 70 self-inflicted deaths in prison. There were almost 300 deaths in prison in total, Prisoner suicide and self-harm are on the rise year on year. Rates of self-harm are the highest on record, and particularly growing amongst the male prison population, where traditionally it's been seen to be a female prison population problem. Levels of literacy in the British prison population are appalling. Over half, 54% of inmates have the literary skills that we would expect of an 11-year-old at school. The prison budget has fallen dramatically, and a knock-on effect obviously of this was that huge numbers of prison service staff were lost. Not only were the staff lost, the experience was lost. And what we're seeing now is a desperate attempt to recruit more prison officers to the system, but so many of those prison officers have no experience whatsoever of working in a prison system with incredibly vulnerable people, particularly vulnerable young men. Over 20% of prison officers have currently been in post for less than a year. We've got issues with overcrowding, we've got too few staff, resulting in too little time out of cells, and obviously too little time with prisoners working in purposeful activities. The National Tactical Response Team, basically the sort of prison riot squad, the increase in the number of times they've been called out in recent years has been over 300% increase in the times that they have been called out. And we've also seen a tripling of the reported numbers of sexual assaults of prisoners in prison as well since 2012. Almost 50% of prisons this year were rated as of concern or of serious concern by a report that was done by the Ministry of Justice. The good news out of all of what's going on in the prison system, as I already mentioned to you, that the number of young people in prison, the number of under 18s, has fallen by 70% in recent years, and they are committing fewer offences. So what on earth do we do about the prison population problem? In this country, our rate of imprisonment is 140 per 100,000 population. 140. If you look at the Netherlands, it's 59. If you look at Germany, it's 78. And we're on 140 per 100,000. What we know is that community orders are much more effective in terms of reducing reoffending, because that's what we've got to start thinking. What is the goal of all of this? Is it punishment, or is it reducing reoffending in the future? If it's about reducing reoffending in the future, we know that community orders work really, really well. But we also know that their use has declined by almost half in the last 5 or 6 years. And in contrast, what we're seeing is a rise in average length of custody in prison, and that's been rising for almost 10 years now. And we're also seeing a rise in the percentage of convicted offenders who are sent for immediate custody, that blue line that you can see going up there. In the UK, it costs about £25,000 per year to keep someone in jail. And what we're seeing from the statistics is that 64% of adults who have served a 12-month sentence or less will have been reconvicted of another offence within a year. And yet we're spending £25,000 a year on doing this. So all of the evidence will point to community orders. Why aren't we using community orders more? And then we come back to the original question of the link between politics and crime, and politics and criminology. Because whatever Stephen Harper, ex-Prime Minister of Canada, would argue, crime does not take place in a vacuum. Crime takes place within a social context, and it takes place within a political context. What we think about crime, what we know about crime, how we respond to crime, all reflects the times in which we live, the political, the economic, and the social conditions in which we live. Politics and criminology are inextricably linked. It would be fantastic if criminal justice policy was the result of beautiful, informed debate and discussion with a reliance on evidence and what works, and that we could, as a country, have a reasoned discussion about what works, how much it costs, and think about the costs in terms of what are the costs financially, what are the costs to the victims, what are the costs to the individuals, what are the costs to the state. All of those issues could be considered in a rational and nicely tempered way. Options would be carefully weighed, and we'd go for the best policy that would work for everybody. What we've seen in this country is that crime rates have steadily been falling, as we've seen since 1995, and are relatively stable now. But what we see is a media, and we see politicians, and we see judges who tend to think that the public want this draconian response to all criminal activity. And they always say, we're doing what the public want. actually what research has shown is that if you look carefully at what the public wants, they don't want hugely draconian punishments for people. They want something that works, and something that works effectively over the long term. And that's what we never really do in this country, because politicians and policymakers don't look at actually the long-term effects, what will be effective crime control over a considerable length of time. What they do instead is look at for immediate gratifications. Let's just whack this one out, let's throw this out, it'll go down well with the public, and it will add to our chances of winning in the next election. So what we've seen in previous probably 2 decades has been electoral success being associated with being tough on crime. Being weak on crime, being soft on crime is akin to political failure. When Kenneth Clarke was sacked by David Cameron, when he was in the coalition as Home Secretary, Chris Grayling came in, and his first response was to do an article in The Sun where he said, I'm going to be the tough guy on crime. And that's always the response. If things aren't going well, be the tough guy on crime, and actually do things that don't result in the most reasoned and better options for the criminal justice system. So nothing is then left to chance. Electoral advantage becomes the most important thing. So politics and criminology are inextricably linked. So at the end of this then, as criminologists, those are the 3 questions that I hope that you can consider. And when people say, what are you doing at university? Well, I'm in a criminology department, I'm doing this and I'm doing that. Hopefully if they say, what's all that about then? I love CSI. Or do you get to dress up in a white suit? You can say, no, what I study are how much crime is there, what causes crime, and how we should control crime. I think that's enough from me. Thank you very much. What I suggest now is that we walk downstairs, where you will meet your course leaders and they will take you to your room. For risk and security